1,000 books, songs, plays, articles, and movies have been written about the 1925 Scopes evolution trial. But history comes alive when you walk into the courtroom in Dayton, Tennessee. You can almost hear William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow argue about creation and evolution, and so much more. Visit the Scopes Trial Museum, and each July see the trial reenacted in the courtroom where it happened. For more information, check out the Scopes Festival website, scopesfestival.com.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session of the Southern Festival of Books, a reading by and interview with Julia Alvarez. I'm Kate Daniels. I'm on the creative writing faculty at Vanderbilt University, and I'm honored to have been asked to host this session with Julia. Thank you all for joining us. Here's what our format will be. The session will run until 3:30. After I finish introducing her and doing just a tiny bit of housekeeping, Julia will read for a few minutes from Afterlife, her new novel, and then I will ask her some questions, interview style, for about half an hour, depending on the time. And then we'll open it up to questions from you, the audience. So you all out there can ask your own questions and have some kind of engagement with Julia. So, introduction. Julia Alvarez, as I'm sure you know, is the author of many books that encompass several different genres and span 3 decades, from her first novel, How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accents, to this brand new novel, Afterlife, which was published just earlier this year. She's also published volumes of poetry, literature for young readers, and several volumes of nonfiction. She's won many awards and recognitions for her work over the years, including the National Medal for the Arts, which Barack Obama presented to her in 2014. I had the extreme pleasure of meeting Julia up in Vermont shortly after that event, where she sat next to me at dinner and gave me a first-person narrative of that extraordinary moment, which is one of the things I'll never forget and I'm very grateful for. Julia is coming to us, I believe, from her home in Vermont, where she's taught as writer-in-residence at Middlebury College for many years and is, like so many of us, teaching on Zoom online this semester. So Julia, on behalf of Humanities Tennessee, welcome to the Southern Festival of Books here in very rainy Nashville, Tennessee. The festival is sponsored by a variety of very loyal and generous supporters: the Metro Nashville Arts Commission, the Tennessee Arts Commission, the Ingram Content Group, Vanderbilt University, and Parnassus Books. Thank you again for coming to us. We're so pleased that you're here, even if it's only in the pixels. Audience, please welcome Julia Alvarez.
Thank you so much, Kate, for your welcome, and Southern Festival of Books and the Humanities Council in Tennessee. It's wonderful to be here with you, even if it is only virtually. And as Kate knows, I am a huge fan of her work. We didn't just happen to sit down at dinner. I stalked her at Bread Loaf and sat next to her because I had just discovered her work through our mutual friend Michael Collier, who told me you're interested in narrative poetry, you've got to read Kate Daniels, and he was right. And so thank you, Kate. I'm very honored to be here with you.
Thank you. So we'll begin, Julia, by you giving us a little bit of a reading, and then I'll ask you some questions. Does that sound good?
That's great. I'm good. I like to read from the beginning of the book because then I don't have to explain everybody, and you have to sort of put all these people together puzzle piece in your head while you're also trying to get inside the prose. So I like to read from the very beginning. And the very beginning here, the prologue is titled Broken English, and I think you'll see why. And we're going to meet Antonia, the main character. And it's the eve of her retirement. She's supposed to meet with her husband, Sam, at their favorite restaurant to celebrate or commemorate her retirement after a long career of teaching. So that's the little bit of background that might help get into the book. Broken English. She is to meet him, a place they often choose for special occasions, to celebrate her retirement from the college, a favorite restaurant, and the new life awaiting her. A half-hour drive from their home, a mountain town, 20 if she speeds in the 30-mile zone. Tonight it makes more sense, a midway point, to arrive separately, as she will be driving down from her doctor's appointment. She gets there first, as he will be driving from home. He should have been there before her. She starts calling his cell. After waiting 10, 20 minutes, he doesn't answer. Irritation turns to worry. No surprise. He always leaves it behind in his work jeans pocket. The hospital, 911, the police. Have you seen him? Or turns off the sound at the movies and then forgets to turn it back on. Can you please help me find him? Even now, months later, about 6 feet, thinning hair, a boy's blue eyes, where she knows good and well, dusk deepening, how he had been driving up the mountain. He feels a stab of pain, already thinking of what he might order, coming from his left side, but radiating out, wondering about her state of mind, the special, if it is special, if she would be excited or terrified, or his default favorite, salmon with lemon dill sauce, like a sword piercing his left side. Substituting mashed potatoes for the fries, they're very good about substitutions. Though how would he know what it feels like to have a sword piercing his left side? Because of his medical training, understanding what is happening, not wanting to cause more harm, pronounced dead on arrival. He forgets to charge it and it runs out of juice. Even now, 3 months shy of a year later, pulling his car off the road, rolling gently to a stop, where she knows exactly what happened. A ditch that might as well be his grave, discovered by a passing cyclist, rushed to the ER. Why he was late. A ruptured aortic aneurysm, as he is to be cremated and therefore have no grave per se. Neither he nor she could have foreseen. Even now, a boy's blue eyes, and cannot comprehend how someone she loved, she keeps running and rerunning that night in her head. Can you please help me find him? Can be nothing but dust, unread emails, fragments, unpaid bills, memories, broken glass, dented bumper, a new life awaiting her. Both terrified and excited. How can it be? Can you help me find him? Tall with thinning hair, a new life awaiting her. Can you help me find him? A mystery she cannot by any means solve. Nevertheless, she keeps asking, where are you? As this is the only way she knows. Can you help me find him? How to create an afterlife for him.
Thank you so much. It's quite an extraordinary opening to a novel. It just throws us right into this amazing story that you tell. It's wonderful to hear you read it. You know, for those of you who don't have the book, it's written almost as a stream of consciousness, how it's put on the page. So there are slash marks that divide instead of ordinary conventional punctuation. It all flows together. It's quite effective. So it's wonderful to hear it read after having read it to myself in my head. I want to start, if you don't mind, with a long, garrulous question. And I'll wind around to an actual point of it at some point. First of all, I just want to tell you that I really love this novel. I read it all in one huge gulp, so much so that I had to go back and read it 2 more times in order to understand what the extraordinary effect of it was on me, to look at the aspects of writing that made me love it so much. At its most basic, it seems to me that Afterlife is a book about loss. If I gave the quiz to my students, what is the major theme of Afterlife? I would want my students to be able to say, it's about loss. This is a short novel in which the main character, Antonia, as you just read to us, undergoes not just one, but two traumatic losses in a very short period of time. And one of the ways that I think she cares for herself and keeps herself from collapsing internally is to lean on literature. Now, she's a retired professor of literature, so her head is stuffed full of quotations that can come to her assistance at all different kinds. One of the most delightful parts of the novel is reading, for a poet, is to read Wallace Stevens and Emily Dickinson and Rilke and all these different quotes from poets popping up throughout the book. It's really wonderful. And this is part of how she makes her way through the terrible loss that she's incurred. Sometimes you talk about this, or you express it directly. At one point you write, art reminds us that we're all connected. And at another point you write, just beautifully, we live in what we imagine. Now, it doesn't always work for Antonia. Sometimes her head is too stuffed with these things. And at one point in the novel, when she's not done very well, Zen class on flower arranging, and the instructor asks what has happened, she points to her head and she goes, too busy in here, too busy in here. But she has this wonderful, well-furnished imagination, and it clearly helps her. Now, I know that you finished this book before the coronavirus set in, changed the world, and changed life for literally every human being on this planet. So you couldn't have anticipated the effect of this novel on someone like me. I found myself throughout the book thinking that this is so profoundly relevant to this extended period of traumatic loss that the entire human race is undergoing at this point. I mean, we trot out these statistics about how many human beings have died, but what about the millions more who are in relation to those people who have been affected by their permanent loss? So as I experience the book, it's incredibly relevant. People are just very stressed right now by this pandemic. It's created a huge mental health crisis. And I see that as one of the themes of this book, caring for the self, figuring out how do we care for ourselves in order to survive loss. And I wonder if you could say something about that. And specifically, since we're writers and people here are so interested in writing, how the consoling uses of literature, all art, as one of those ways to care for the self.
Oh gosh, there's so much there, Kate. I think it is a novel about loss and mourning, and it was written pre-pandemic. However, now, going back to it, I feel like, wow, this is so much about the moment we're living in. But, even before the pandemic, I think the pandemic has brought everything more to the surface. I think I was thinking for so long before this that we were living in what I call elegiac times, where we were seeing the end of so many things. Extinct species, the climate change, coastlines going underwater, huge storms, a divisiveness, the lack of a civil society, gun violence, violence against communities of colors. It felt like everything was falling apart. Why that first prologue, unlike the rest of the book that doesn't use that same kind of chopped fragmentation, but everything was falling apart. I felt like that's the moment that Antonia is living in. And who knows, all of a sudden, I feel like the pandemic it's there. And I think that in part, not to privilege artists, but I think that we are people that are with our little antennas out a lot. That's part of our job description, right? What Henry James said, to the young writer, be him or her on whom nothing is lost. So I think that writers pick up the zeitgeist, not in any intellectual or analytical way, but it gets the juice if you're present and sort of responsible as an artist to living in your time as well as in your literature, you will pick this up. So I feel like I was picking it up. And so it just, very much is about a person where her world falls apart, and how will she live in a broken world and not lose faith in others or in herself? How do you make meaning of it? And of course, being a literature professor and having a huge, long career in literature, these words, these passages, these poems, these stories have fed her and nourished her and been her string through the labyrinth. But just as that is important to her, I also wanted what I call a chastening. Sometimes the words are not enough. Sometimes the word becomes flesh. And the abstract things you talk about, Scylla and Charybdis and all these things she's used to saying and these beautiful passages, sometimes they fail us. And we have to acknowledge that, because then we know of their limitations and we feel also their power, So sometimes, the thing that was so beautiful in literature shows up as someone in your garage, or disappears. Your sister disappears, and all of a sudden, there's a chastening that happens. And I thought often in this book, because I have passages that didn't get in there, but that are in my head, is that wonderful passage by Wordsworth, looking at a picture later in life after he's lost his brother. And he has a beautiful line that goes, "A deep distress has humanized my soul." And I think that's very much also what happens to Antonia,
Yeah.
And that's a long answer, sorry.
It's a great, but and I think it's not only artists and writers and professors of literature and art who can do this for themselves. One of the things the pandemic seems to have shown us is the remarkable creativity of so many people in figuring out how to live in this brand new way, and how they can keep themselves together, how they can take care of themselves and their children. And sometimes I have to focus on that in order to get through.
When we were in Milan at the beginning of the height of the pandemic there, and a video arrived. I don't know how these things get to me, and it was of people on balconies playing music and singing to each other, call and response, and sort of being together apart, which is what reading has always been about anyhow. So in a sense, I feel like, hey, as a reader, I've prepared for this, right?
Yeah. Another thing I wanted to ask you about, so in terms of my delight and my appreciation of this novel, is there's so many overlapping themes, so many things that you bring into a relatively short novel and treat in a really fully developed way that it's just extraordinary. But one of the particular things that I'm interested in has to do with my own interest in what is called the health humanities. And so I'm really interested in I've done a lot in this as you know, in addiction and representations of addiction.
And your wonderful book that just came out.
Julie, this is your section.
No. I think it's important.
Thank you so much.
We're all in this circle together. Sometimes one of us gets the chance to talk, but we're all in this together.
That's very generous. But in your case, what I'm particularly interested in, which is relevant to this novel, is your depiction of mental illness. And I'm particularly interested in the way you describe it in a family setting, in an enlarged familial context. Like so many families, my own includes people who struggle currently and have struggled mightily with mental illnesses of various types, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia. There's suicide in earlier generations of our family, many of the destructive behaviors of addiction. There's a character, I'm trying not to do any spoilers in the novel because I know there's people out in the audience who haven't read it yet. So there is a character in Afterlife, one of the sisters, Izzy, one of Antonia's sisters, who has bipolar disorder. And there's a fascinating scene in a psychiatrist's office when her sisters have convinced her to come to a kind of an intervention to talk about the possibility of finally getting some real treatment, of going into treatment for her disorder and learning how to manage her disorder in order to live more, let's just say, functionally. And what I love about that is the close view of how families are affected by the mental illness of their loved ones. So often in the depictions of people struggling with mental disorders or mental illness, even in really great literature, I sense that it's the depiction, the representation is very stigmatizing, even judgmental, sometimes moralizing. Certainly that's true out there in the public. And I think one of the great virtues of this wonderful little novel is the way in which you present the love and the care and the tenderness, as well as everything else, the extraordinary frustration and fear that families feel when they're trying to access services for a loved one who's ill, mentally ill, in a healthcare, disaster like we have in the United States, where we have another theme of the book has to do with access to healthcare, availability of healthcare, cost of healthcare. Anyway, I wonder if you would talk a little bit about that, your inclusion of representations of mental illness.
Yeah, I think as you say, it's very complicated. How to help people and what will help, and the sisters' efforts to help their sister it sometimes doesn't help because they have different takes on what should be done and how it should be managed, and that just further complicates it. And I think one of the things that's hard for Antonia, several things. One of them is that some of the emotions that and crazed thinking, as that's termed, of her sister Izzy, also have a nobility to them. That being more functional and taking care of yourself and managing yourself loses some of that grandness that Antonia is drawn to, and so she admires some things about Izzy and her generosity of spirit and her casting her bread upon the waters. And then when that's not enough, casting herself upon the waters. That's not good. But she sort of admires it. So I didn't want a simple either or, this is what you do if someone has this, because I don't think literature ultimately has answers or necessarily the perfect take on something. But I think that literature, what is it? Chekhov said that the task of the writer is not to solve the problem, but to state it correctly. So I wanted the full complication of how the different sisters feel about this and how to manage it, even though in the end they come together, and how they might help Izzy. The other thing that complicates it, is that they come from another culture. And how does biculturalness and other traditions about what is mental illness, how that compromises their understanding of what she's going through. Because, if you look at in their culture, let's say Latinx culture, we have curanderas that get mounted by spirits and throw fits and do healings and speak in voices. And, and so they're no longer there. It would be too simple to say, oh, that's my culture, you're not respecting it. They're too complicated for that. But how does that play into, because we know that Izzy, who was also herself a mental health care provider, started a whole practice precisely, thinking of non-Eurocentric ways of dealing with mental illness. So there's that too. I wanted one of the things that one of the reasons this novel took me so long, first off, is it's harder to write a shorter novel. You know, that quote I said earlier, what Pascal said, had I had more time, I would have written a shorter letter, and he wrote a long one instead. But part of the thing that I wanted is I wanted characters that were accurate and as complex as I know I am, and I know the people that I most admire and I'm close to are. I wanted that to be there, and no flattening. So often with an older Latina character, she turns into a curandera or an abuelita, or these little tropes. And these women are too complicated for that. And I wanted to explore what it is, how that kind of stage of life. I talk about this also as my first novel as an elder. There was a sass and a humor and a little bit of a show offiness. I read that early work and I just feel like, wow, the energy and the, youth in it, and the pluck in it. And this is a different, more tempered, novel. And I had to learn to integrate what it means to be an elder, to be able to even write accurately, or hopefully accurately, about this time in life.
Yeah. Yeah, I read that little essay that you read about this being your first novel as an elder, and that occurred to me too, that there's a different, as you say, almost a different tempo compared to some of your very early works in particular. And there's something about this it feels very, it feels, this is trite, but it does feel very poem-like because the elements of it are so connected, but there's a stately feel to it. And this is a narrator who she's figured out a few things. She hasn't figured out everything, but she's figured out a few things because she's been around a while, and she's not so conflicted about owning those things. Those are harder to do when we're young. We're often brash, or we're arrogant, or we're insecure, one or the other sort of. But she's able to do that, and it lends a really wonderful feel, I think, almost rhythmically to this book. It's really incredible. But with what you said, your answer to this question about wanting these characters are complex and nuanced. You wanted to present them in their full complexity and depth. Reminds me of one of the questions that occurred to me that I wanted to ask you about. I hope you don't think it's a little nutty, but so the title of the novel is Afterlife. But the more I thought about it, I thought it could just as easily have, you could just as easily have titled it Underlife. And I thought, because it seems to me that so much of what's going on, and so much of the way that you do represent these characters, describe them, is about what's going on under the surface of what we see and call life. And just to give you a few of my thoughts about this. So Antonia looks, well off. She looks privileged to others, but internally, she's a mess. She's just struggling, making her way sometimes moment to moment to get through widowhood and the other traumatic bereavement that she ultimately experiences in the novel. And also coming out of those intense conflicts that she articulates to herself over and over again about, what do I owe to other people and what do I owe to myself? Again, this sort of theme of self-care, Izzy, her sister, appears on the surface to be this amazing free spirit and sort of bohemian, endlessly creative and energetic. In reality, of course, she's struggling with very serious, untreated bipolar disorder, which can look, as you say, excitingly creative and on the surface and very attractive to other people. The real estate agent who's trying to sell her the property seems to only respond to that part of her and to not have a sense that there's this whole underlife to her that's going to become very, important. And Izzy, as it turns out, of course, is struggling with sort of catastrophic depression and hopelessness underneath this free-spirited exterior. Even I thought of, Roger, the farmer, the next door neighbor, the curmudgeonly, taciturn, sort of stereotypical New Englander who that's what he is on the surface, and he's employing undocumented workers, and he's gruff, and he's always sort of threatening. He's going to do the mean, terrible thing, get rid of the workers, won't take in the pregnant girlfriend. But he's deeper than that. He's more complicated than that. He's a really good neighbor, and he's an organic farmer, but for some reason he can't advertise his products as organic products. He's an incredibly interesting character to me in all kinds of ways. And then finally, even the sheriff, who is of course a law enforcement officer and is bound on the surface by all those identifying characteristics. He's almost a kind of agent of ICE, but of course he's not, but he's in that sort of realm. And a lot of times he is acting in accord with that, but not always. So him as well. There's an underlife. And I love the richness of this, because I have to say, one of the reasons I think I responded to it as I did, as being so much about this moment, that is it's hard to find ways to be hopeful right now. And this novel, and thinking about these characters and their underlives, was one way that I did that. So I wonder if you talk about the underlife of
oh, that's a wonderful. Boy, would my editor have loved for you to talk me into that, because they were not very excited about Afterlife. They thought, oh dear, this sends the wrong message, that this is going to be about heaven and, a religious, Julia Alvarez turned, later in life to all kinds of religious things. But, for me, Afterlife is so much, in part about the title, in part about how if we live, even as long, I just turned 70, if we live even as long as 50 years old, we die many little deaths, and if we're resilient, and if we're lucky, and if we have resources, and if we find helpers, we survive all these little deaths and continue in an afterlife. And my hope is that next life is a larger version of the self, so that was one thing. And also that I find in my own life with loss, that I really, when I lose people that I deeply love, the only way that I found solace is to think that I have to keep alive the things in them that I love, because if those die too, they're really dead, and they've been lost to the world. So, those qualities. And so many times in my own life, when I'm faced with a situation and I have, my beloved people that have gone, I think, okay, I'm going to channel, my favorite auntie. Okay, I can be that, as generous as this person I've lost, that's an afterlife. That's the only afterlife that I think is possible, to make those qualities, to embody them in some way that's also true to you. So you have to do that. But too, and that's very accurate, the thing about underlife, that I think part of what what I wanted to get to in this novel is, we talk about diversity and granting, a diverse community. And how does that play out in terms of granting ourselves diversity, all the messiness that we are? And also, instead of putting people in these labels and boxes, which makes it very tidy to move them around in our imagination so we can feel in control, what happens when they surprise us? And they're diverse. I mean, that to me would be a really diverse society when we grant that diversity and complexity and respect to the other that we want to other us and flatten. So that's, I think, very much what is happening in terms of the underlife, that she's constantly being surprised. And I think I feel very hopeful when that happens in my own life, oh, I was wrong about that. That mean SOB is really can do a kind thing too. I mean, it's hopeful to me for some reason.
Yeah, it's really, and you do it in all kinds of ways. My voice is sounding odd to me. I don't know if it is to you.
Yeah, you're cutting in and out. I don't know why from time to time. Yeah.
What I was going to say was you do it in all different kinds of ways. Sometimes it's positive. Other times it's negative, like when Estella shows up pregnant, but there's a surprise about the pregnancy that we didn't know. So we have to explore people's complexity from all different perspectives. It's just a wonderful aspect of the novel. And what you say also reminds me that, so I read something that you wrote, maybe it was in the same little essay where you talked about Afterlife being your first novel as an elder, and looks like, we don't have any questions yet from the audience, but we only have 10 minutes left. So if you want to ask Julia Alvarez a question, go ahead. You can cut mine off, Julia, if we do get a question. But what I was going to say was, I read that little essay, and in there you wrote this wonderful sentence, or two wonderful sentences. We owe the generations coming our deepest, truest activism, doing the work we love to do. And for you, I'm assuming, of course, that is writing. And one of the many things, again, about Afterlife that impressed me so much and made me love it so much was it's not just a beautiful novel full of these unforgettable characters put in this situation that people are working through, but it's an important and timely novel in terms of its subject matter. It covers really a great deal of ground in terms of contemporary political content. I've mentioned some of them, many different aspects of the whole situation of immigration in the United States, certainly the treatment of undocumented persons, not only by the administration, legal structures, but ordinary Americans who live here, all different aspects of healthcare. And as you yourself just mentioned, all different experiences of cultural diversity and inclusivity. Yet one of the things that I think is true is that most readers would not call this a political novel. I, as a teacher of literature, would call it a profoundly political novel, but I don't think most readers would. And I very much admire the way that the political content is what we would call naturalized, almost an organic part of the whole book. You don't even notice it, or you don't necessarily need to notice it until you start thinking back about, what did I just read and what did it mean that there were these undocumented workers in these situations and their intersection with all these different aspects of this small world in Vermont that they live in. And so I think it sinks into readers' consciousness in different ways that seems particularly probably salutary to me in the moment we're living in, when we are so divided and set apart from each other. So I wonder if you might say something about that.
Oh, I think, what you mentioned to me is really important. Something I try too with my students, I think it was Henry Thurman or Howard Thurman, can't remember his first name, who said, don't ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive, because what the world needs is people who have come alive. And I think the way that we best serve is to find what is in us, that is our talent and our passion, what we love, because then we're infusing the world with what we love rather than what we owe or what we need. It's activism that increases the love and increases if you're doing it from love, then you're doing it, that's the energy that's getting in there. So I think that is the most profound politics. And by the same token, I think there are moments in history that we are called to also, what Antonia learns, that sometimes the words are not enough. Sometimes it's not enough to exercise our passion. But how can we use it to serve our communities and to get transformative change to happen? And I think actually, I think of this Kunitz passage at the end of his life that he said he felt ashamed that he hadn't written that he had written so few poems on political themes or the causes that agitate him. And he said, and then I remind myself that to choose to live as a poet in the modern superstate is in itself a political action. And I love that, to choose this, your passion and to exercise it is a form of political action that is really important. And so I don't want to minimize that. So yeah, it's always, there's never an either or. Oh, you do your art and that is the message of this book. Or you go out on the street. I think it's always a balancing. And I think what makes, I guess a person with moral imagination, what I think of is not a person that has the answers, but a person that's constantly asking themselves that question, or the three questions that Tolstoy has, what is the right thing to do? When is the right moment to do it? Who is the most important one? And not to ever settle on something. It's painful, it's hard work, but that is to me to live, out of a moral center.
That's a beautiful answer. Thank you. So I'm going to read you a couple of these comments. There's only one question and you can say yes or no. So because we're almost at the end of our time, but I did want to share these comments with you. This is from Suzanne. When I had said, ask your questions, Suzanne wrote back, it's wonderful just to hear Julia talk. And then someone else said, thank you so much for being here today. I really enjoyed the book and its cast of characters. And then the same person asked the one question. So you can answer this however you want. This is the question. I'm new to your books. Do you think about writing a sequel to Afterlife?
Oh my goodness. The sequel will be Underlife. And I will write it together.
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
There you go. I never think in those ways because, I've always been a writer that, it's a messy process for me to write a book. I don't know ahead of time. I used to think when I would go to Breadloaf, I would be terrified to be there with all these real writers. And I had this idea in my head that they got a clean notebook and they started at the beginning. This is when people wrote with their hands on books, paper, that they started at the beginning and they just already knew where they were going. And they wrote the book and then they went through and changed a few things, but those were the real writers. And I thought, wow, I am so messy and I don't enjoy a lot of the devices because they're devious, they're distracting. But one of the things that has helped is that you can change things around. And, when it used to be just typing and maybe we wrote a lot in our heads or before we wrote, but, my process is so messy. So I never know. Even when I don't ever talk about what I'm working on, because I find that the minute I do, I've kind of set it, it's set like Jello. And then it's very hard to get it to move. And for me not to colonize my book with what I want to impose on it. And instead, listen, learn and take the turns and make a wrong turn. And this character doesn't work and these two need to be combined. And, it's just a messy, messy process. And once I talk to people at Breadloaf, guess what? Everybody came out of the closet with their, oh my God. This is what writing is about, Writing is constant revising and listening and following. And one of my favorite, I have all these quotes. I know I suffer from Antonia's, or she got my DNA. But one of the things that I love is this Mayan Weaver prayer, when they sit, it's kind of like they're almost kneeling when they're at their loom, because they're like their legs are tucked in and the loom is before them, and they say a prayer before they start, because these are fibers they've made and natural colorings, and everything depends on the weather and what they found, and they don't have a pattern. They don't follow a pattern. And the prayer is, grant me the intelligence and the patience to find the true pattern. And that could be my prayer every day that I sit down. And they're both important. The insight, the craft that you've learned, the intelligence, being humble enough to learn from others, and absorb it, but also the patience, the endless patience and never knowing. I mean, they'll never know. They never know if the weaving is going to work out.
Yeah.
If those fibers are going to come together, if the colors will, but the intelligence and the patience to find the true pattern.
Well, Julia Alvarez, thank you so much. Thank you for the intelligence and the patience, the extraordinary creativity, and the humility that underlies all of your works. But I think in particular this novel, which has just moved me so deeply, it was an honor to be able to talk to you about it. And I'm sorry you couldn't see your audience. I couldn't see them either, but I know from some of these comments that people are very moved by what you said. Thank you so very much for being here at the Southern Festival of Books.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you, audience, for the patience and intelligence to hang in there with a Yaqui author. I guess part of the pandemic is that you just sometimes, yeah.
We do the best we can. Okay, thank you.
Take care of yourself, stay safe, and don't forget to vote. Vote, please. Okay, thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.